Now, for the first time in 12 years, Israelis on Monday woke up to a new prime minister. This after Naftali Bennett secured the backing of parliament and ousted longtime leader Benjamin Netanyahu. The two held a brief handover meeting in the afternoon, but without the formal ceremony that traditionally accompanies a change in government. Minutes after the meeting, though, Netanyahu repeated a pledge to topple the new government approved on Sunday by a 60 to 59 vote in parliament. Israel's parliament, the Knesset, narrowly approved the new Bennett-led coalition on Sunday, ending Netanyahu's historic 12-year rule. Bennett now presides over a diverse and fragile coalition comprised of 8 small and mid-sized parties with deep ideological differences. Netanyahu has now joined the opposition benches in parliament. In the meantime, the coalition includes 3 parties that are headed by politicians who used to be Netanyahu allies, including Bennett. Under coalition agreement, Bennett will hold the office of premier for the first 2 years of the term, and then Foreign Minister Yair Lapid, the architect of the coalition, will become Prime Minister after that. Well, to get a better sense of who the new Israeli Prime Minister Bennett is, we're now joined by human rights lawyer and visiting fellow at the US Based Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Zaha Hassan, in the capital, Washington, D.C. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So 12 years, the Netanyahu period is over. Is this quite a significant shift in Israeli politics, or we still have to wait and see?
No, I think what we can say is that there was widespread agreement on ousting Netanyahu. That's what this coalition, this change coalition, is all about. There is also an agreement that the stalemate in terms of the election results over the last 4 elections that we've had needed to be resolved, and a state budget needed to be passed. So these are the 2 things that this coalition has agreed on: the ousting of Netanyahu and the need to get to work on domestic issues facing Israel. And what was also agreed was that the Palestinian issue would be marginalized, and there would be little agitation with the U.S. administration on Israel's annexation and ongoing de facto annexation of the West Bank. So these are the things we can expect from this coalition. Whether it can last very long is what remains to be seen, because it is so diverse. You're talking about far left to hard right parties represented in this coalition.
Yeah, I mean, you know, most people will say the only thing they've got in common is they just wanted to see the back of Netanyahu. And now, how do they deal with the issues that citizens need to deal with every single day when they just are so far apart in terms of domestic issues in Israel?
That's right. It's really difficult to see how this coalition is going to be able to manage the challenges that Israel faces. In particular, as we saw in the last escalation of violence between Israel and Hamas, and the bombardment of Gaza by Hamas, there is the issue of the Palestinians under Israeli control, those inside of Israel who were protesting and who faced mob violence during those protests, and those in Jerusalem who are not under the authority of the Palestinian Authority but are under Israeli authority but have no citizenship status and are facing evictions, and the Palestinians in the occupied territories in the West Bank and in Gaza who are also, in the West Bank facing forced removal and colonization, and in Gaza, the blockade and siege that has lasted over 10 years. So the question is, how will this, as much as the Israel-Palestine peacemaking file is a foreign policy agenda item for Israel that it hopes not to have to deal with, it's also a domestic issue for Israel. It's treatment of the Palestinians and its ongoing colonization. So the idea that this coalition can sideline that issue while it continues to proceed with other domestic agenda items, I think is not very realistic.
One hot button issue with the international community is the issue of the settlements, and Bennett seems to be one that's been supporting them, and this will be a problem, no doubt. Do they just ignore the question? Do they just ignore the issue, or what happens?
I think this administration, the Biden administration in the U.S., is hoping not to have to engage too heavily, if at all, on the Israel-Palestine peacemaking file. As you noted earlier on, Naftali Bennett, who will be the prime minister for the first 2 years, was the leader of the settler council, the settler movement in Israel. And he was very much in support of the annexation, the official annexation of 60% of the West Bank. And he's definitely interested in continuing to pursue settlement construction, particularly in East Jerusalem and areas like Sheikh Jarrah, which we saw during the months of April and May, the forced evictions of Palestinian families there, the threatened evictions of Palestinian families there, which amount to war crimes because of the fact Israel is an occupying power over East Jerusalem. But we also have Yair Lapid as foreign minister. Now, this, I think, is a very interesting move to have him as foreign minister because he's a centrist. And he presents very well to the international community, coming from as a journalist who's very comfortable in front of cameras, very comfortable, in a more diplomatic role. But he also is not one that is interested in withdrawing from the occupied territories and seeing the emergence of a sovereign Palestinian state. He talks a good game when he is engaged with foreign officials, particularly in the U.S., about a two-state solution and the need for it. But ultimately, his vision of a two-state solution falls short of actual sovereignty and self-determination for Palestinians. And then you have somebody like Benny Gantz from the Kahol Lavan party, who is a former IDF chief of staff, who's going to be defense minister in this government. Now, Gantz is facing investigation by the International Criminal Court for his role in the 2014 bombardment of Gaza, which legal experts say Israel committed war crimes during that engagement and escalation of violence. So this is these are the three top positions in the Israeli cabinet, and it doesn't really bode well for the idea that you're going to have any serious change in the way Israel approaches Palestinians.
Why did Naftali get the nod in terms of becoming prime minister? They have fewer seats than some of the other parties.
That's right. I think it's more of a compromise idea to ward off some of the more allegations that this is a left-wing coalition. But there was also the interest in having Yair Lapid repair the international relations of Israel when it comes to the Western European countries and also with the U.S. This is seen as a high priority, particularly given the 4 years under Trump. So this was something I think was of interest to both Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid. One, to sort of quelch the right wing and allegations that this is a left wing coalition, and also to really work on and prioritize repairing relations with the U.S. and other important countries to Israel.
So the one wild card which surprised, perhaps not for some, is Mansour Abbas and his party. coming to this coalition. What's in it for them? What will they get out of this?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting development because we've never seen this in Israel's history, where you had an Palestinian party openly supporting the government. Now, they're not holding any cabinet positions. That's still not in the cards for a Palestinian party. But Ram, which is the Islamist party inside of Israel, won the leadership of two Knesset committees that were important to them, the Interior Committee and the Committee on Arab Community Affairs. There's a lot of neglect of Palestinian communities inside of Israel, and there's a lot of frustration with the lack of prioritizing the budget in those communities. So this is something that Ram would like to see worked on and prioritized. There's also the opportunity for the party to assume the role of deputy chairman of the Knesset and deputy minister at the prime minister's office. So these will also deal with economic concerns of the Palestinian community inside of Israel, and that were very important to Ram to take authority over.
All right, so with 30 seats, Likud is definitely the biggest party in the Knesset. Can they still spoil the party with Benjamin Netanyahu obviously unhappy and vowing to cause chaos and mayhem as much as possible? Can they still be a problem for this coalition?
I think they can. I think they can definitely be a problem for this coalition. Netanyahu has proven himself to be a very flexible and creative tactician, and he is still the leader of the Likud party, and he is still well loved by that party. So I don't think we should cancel out the possibility that you will see some machinations coming from Likud led by Netanyahu. But even in the absence of Netanyahu, you know, the Likud is not so different from, say, the Kahol Lavan or the Yamina party of Naftali Bennett. Now, these are offshoots of Likud, and so these parties will find common ground on a lot of issues, particularly when you're talking about Israel's policies in the occupied territories. So while there are likely to be efforts to bring down this government while Netanyahu is still heading Likud, the reality is that these other parties that are to the right of Likud aren't really that different, having been offshoots of Likud to begin with.